prebiotic nitrate gum is to intentionally marinate the oral microbiome with those prebiotic nitrates for the sake of improving the composition of the oral microbiome and improving the nitrate reducing capacity of the oral microbiome. Welcome, everybody. My name is Brendan Vermeire. I'm a functional medicine practitioner, clinical educator and researcher, and I'm the clinical education manager for Berkeley Life and the host of The More You Know series. The More You Know is a monthly webcast designed to bring you hot topics and takes on the importance of nitric oxide and blood flow for optimizing the body's natural healing systems. We encourage you to watch, share, and pause the video to take in all of the information. Do you have a topic that you'd like to see us feature? Reach out to us at info@berkeleylife.com. We appreciate you joining us. Now on to the show. Hi, functional friends. Welcome back to the More You Know series. As always, I'm your host, Brendan Vermeire, and today we're going to be talking about the oral gut microbiome axis. So certainly in episode 2, we talked a lot about the oral microbiome and its implications in regards to cardiovascular health and really a wide range of systemic and chronic disease conditions. So today we're going to continue and expand that conversation in looking at the interface of the oral and gut microbiome axis. So let's go ahead and dig in. So certainly we're going to be briefly discussing the miracle molecule in relation to chronic disease care, including gut health, gain clarity on the role of the microbiome in regulating nitric oxide and how improving nitric oxide regulation also helps us to better regulate gut health and gastrointestinal function. And of course, as always, trying to make sure I'm equipping you with clinical tools and assessments and therapeutic strategies to optimize patient clinical outcomes and really help your patients feel better faster by leveraging the healing power of nitric oxide. So certainly in every episode, I just want to make sure I'm highlighting the role that nitric oxide plays in chronic disease care, because of course, as we can all appreciate, chronic disease is really at epidemic or arguably pandemic proportions, with 6 in 10 Americans having a chronic disease, 4 in 10 having 2 or more chronic conditions. And we see those top 10 causes of death for all Americans. And we see this wealth of literature that shows how nitric oxide is implicated in all of these conditions. So as I said in the last episode, and we'll probably say in every future episode, we have to be paying attention to nitric oxide and the dual role that this is playing in the chronic disease crisis. So certainly, as we always say, really optimizing blood flow. This is the foundation of all healing programs in general. So this is why at Berkeley Life, we're leveraging this miracle molecule to help your patients feel better faster. And I always like to touch on our 2 major pathways to obtain nitric oxide. So this is our more simplified pathway that we've seen in previous episode, but I have something special for you all today in this new episode here because I created this brand new, more comprehensive graphic that is quite a bit more in-depth than the previous image there. So this is a custom graphic that I made in order to break down the nuance and the technicalities of how we produce nitric oxide. Now, certainly in this TED Talk style interview today, we don't have time to go through step by step every mechanism, but this is where, just to briefly recap, most practitioners that are aware of nitric oxide are more familiar with the nitric oxide synthase pathway over here on the left side of the screen, where we're using L-arginine as the substrate, along with many cofactors, including molecular oxygen and bioterin, NADPH, FMN, FAD, magnesium, heme iron, glutathione, so on and so forth. All of this to endogenously manufacture nitric oxide through either the NOS1, 2, or 3 enzymes. Now, as I've said previously, there's a lot of things that can go wrong with the nitric oxide synthase pathway. What if we have NOS polymorphisms? There are genetic SNPs and polymorphisms for NOS1, 2, and 3 that can increase the susceptibility to nitric oxide dysregulation and uncoupling? What if we don't have enough substrate or cofactors or molecular oxygen? What if there's some sort of inhibitory component, such as oxidative stress and inflammation, that causes this nitric oxide synthase uncoupling that I have broken down over here? And so under these types of circumstances, when we have that NOS uncoupling, instead of getting nitric oxide, we get superoxide radicals that then can contribute to more oxidative stress, more inflammation, more nitric oxide synthase uncoupling, right? So this is why at Berkeley Life, get my face out of the way here, we leverage the nitrate pathway. We are using dietary nitrate through our nitric oxide foundation product, and we're using salivary nitrite test strips, right? So we supplement with dietary nitrate and encourage a nitrate-rich diet to make sure that our nitrate reservoir is always full. So that way we can properly reduce nitrate into nitrite, which is what we're measuring on the testing strips, and then reduce that further into nitric oxide. Now, an important point I want to make before we get into the oral and gut microbiome axis here is really looking at, we can kind of think of the oral microbiome, the acidic stomach environment, and the gastrointestinal microbiome as sort of this three-step or three-stage sort of filter system by which we can reduce nitrate into nitric oxide. Not all dietary nitrate that we consume is going to be reduced to nitric oxide locally in the oral cavity. Some of that nitrate can make it all the way down into the intestines without being reduced. Some of it will get absorbed into systemic circulation as nitrate, right? But we have these three stages and opportunities with the oral microbiome that can reduce nitrate to nitrite or nitric oxide, assuming that we have an intact oral microbiome that isn't dysbiotic and has plenty of nitrate reducing bacterial strains. And then we have that step 2 or stage 2 in the acidic stomach environment, where nitrate and nitrite can be reduced to nitric oxide, which can have beneficial effects locally within the gastric mucosa or systemically through its gaseous signaling molecule effects systemically. And then in the intestines, we can further reduce nitrate or nitrite to nitric oxide. So it's important to understand there's a lot of flux here, and the oral microbiome and the gut microbiome really primarily regulate this conversion of nitrate reduction, but also nitric oxide oxidation, right? So any of you that are familiar with redox biochemistry in general, understanding there's reduction and oxidation, and there can be flux going on here. So nitric oxide can and will be oxidized back to nitrite or even nitrate. Nitrate is the most stable of the three molecules. Nitric oxide is the shortest half-life, least stable. So there's this continuum of reduction, oxidation with nitrite to nitric oxide, and nitric oxide back to nitrate through oxidation reduction, right? So let's go ahead and move on, keeping that concept in mind. Understanding nitric oxide production does decline naturally through the aging, through the immunosenescence and inflammaging process. However, as I always like to say, it's not just in individuals over the age of 40 that need to be worried about their or concerned, aware of their endothelial function or nitric oxide production, but because we are seeing chronic disease and chronic inflammatory conditions in younger and younger people. We see children under the age of 10 with type 2 diabetes and a multitude of conditions, right? So it's not just individuals over 40. We have to be considering anyone with a chronic disease is going to have dysregulated nitric oxide. So of course, many reasons to focus on nitric oxide clinically, even supporting gut healing, which is going to be the main focal point for today. So certainly I won't insult your intelligence by reading all of these. You can pause, read through it, and appreciate your client or patient demographic. What are they struggling with? I guarantee you, all of us practitioners, we have clients and patients that fit into this criteria. So certainly a list of low nitric oxide signs and symptoms. Again, you can pause, read this in depth, and think which one of your clients and patients might benefit from supporting nitric oxide. And I'll give you a hint. It's all of them. So let's go ahead and move on here. I want to get to the good stuff in regards to the gut healing. So the regulation of nitric oxide is critical for whole body overall health. Imbalances or dysregulation of this important system can directly contribute to not only cardiovascular and metabolic disease, but also neurological, gastrointestinal, and even immune-related conditions. So in our last episode, episode 2, we really focused primarily on the oral microbiome, that garden of life in the oral cavity that can obviously be negatively impacted by many lifestyle and environmental and oral hygiene practices, whether it's excess antibiotic use or that chlorhexidine-based mouthwash, supplements, smoking, vaping, so on and so forth, right? So certainly if you missed episode 2, maybe go back, give it a 23-minute listen and watch so you're up to speed here, because just for the sake of time, I want to continue and expand the conversation, not spend all of our time recapping. So this is a great excerpt right out of the literature that shows some of the major nitrate-reducing bacterial species that should, under normal conditions, be present within the oral cavity. And these are the bacteria that are helping us to reduce that dietary nitrate into nitrite and then ultimately nitric oxide so we can get all the beneficial effects here. And keep in mind that the dietary nitrate does have prebiotic-like properties, which is why we actually, a few months back, rolled out our brand new prebiotic nitrate gum. And the point of putting the dietary nitrate into a gum matrix is to intentionally marinate the oral microbiome with those prebiotic nitrates for the sake of improving the composition of the oral microbiome and improving the nitrate reducing capacity of the oral microbiome for individuals that have a dysbiotic and damaged and deficient oral microbiome, right? So this is where the oral microbiome directly overlaps with the gastrointestinal microbiome. In a lot of ways, you could really say the oral microbiome, that's the starting point for the gastrointestinal microbiome, right? So whatever the composition is in the oral hygiene practices and the microbes in our oral cavity, that is literally directly connected to our stomach and then our intestinal microbiota. So this is where it really starts up here in the oral cavity. And if we can optimize the oral composition, then we can have a powerful downstream effect on the stomach and the intestinal microbiota as well. So this is where the dietary nitrate can replenish the oral and gut microbiome. Then it just becomes a question of, are we encapsulating the dietary nitrate or putting it into a gum matrix so that way we can marinate those oral microbes with the dietary nitrate. So this is obviously where the oral hygiene practices come into play. But then further, when we're really starting to now expand the conversation into the gastrointestinal microbiome, this is where there's a beautiful interface between blood flow and the gastrointestinal tract, right? So certainly with the gastrointestinal tract, if we're thinking, well, how do we get things into systemic circulation to begin with? Well, really through the gastrointestinal tract, right? We have to take in dietary nutrient and we have to digest and absorb and assimilate those nutrients. In order to get all of those nutrients into the bloodstream and then have optimal blood flow to be able to deliver those nutrients and the oxygen and the immune cells to the target tissues, right? So certainly by promoting good gut health, we are also promoting healthy circulation and blood flow, but also by promoting healthy blood flow, we're increasing blood flow, oxygenation, nutrient delivery, immune cell transportation to the gastrointestinal tissues themselves, right? So this is a beautiful combination where we can work on optimizing nitric oxide, both for the sake of optimizing blood flow to the gut and optimizing gut health to then lead to better blood flow and better nutritional uptake into the blood, right? So nitric oxide directly is promoting mucosal blood flow and is also stimulating the mucous membrane integrity and the tight junction integrity, right? So nitric oxide directly contributes to the production of our mucin 1, mucin 2, to form a healthy mucous membrane that line of defense that separates the intestinal lumen from systemic circulation. So we need adequate nitric oxide and nitric oxide signaling in order to stimulate that mucus secretion for that sort of chemical defense barrier, if you will. Now, further, nitric oxide does have antimicrobial effects. Keep in mind, our immune cells express inducible nitric oxide synthase for the sake of using nitric oxide as an antimicrobial molecule to fight off foreign pathogens and invaders in the body, right? So nitric oxide can have this sort of microbial regulating role that's modulating the composition of the microbiome itself. Now, these microbes are also, some of them, able to uptake nitrate and reduce it to nitrite and nitric oxide, but they're also, some of them, able to oxidize nitric oxide back into nitrite or nitrate. So there's this flux going on, and the microbes can use nitric oxide as a signaling molecule amongst themselves to influence processes like cell adhesion or proliferation, virulence factor expression, and quorum sensing as well in their epigenetic expressions. So you really cannot fully heal the gut without adequate nitric oxide levels to support mucosal integrity and reduce leakiness. So as I was saying before, the nitric oxide does have a regulatory role on the tight junctions, zonulin, auchlidin, claudin, all of our tight junction proteins that sort of tie one epithelial cell to another. Further, the epithelial cells themselves do express inducible nitric oxide synthase, which is the dominant nitric oxide synthase form expressed by immune cells, such as macrophages, for example. So we have to have adequate nitric oxide, not only for the composition of the microbiome, not only for the mucous membrane, but also for the tight junctions themselves. So when we're talking about the detriment of having a dysbiotic gut, a compromised mucous membrane, a compromised intestinal epithelial tissue, or a leaky gut, that then can allow a lot of microbial components, things like endotoxins and exotoxins and mycotoxins and undigested food antigens and toxicants, heavy metals, the list goes on and on. When we have that hyperpermeability, all of these toxins and toxicants and microbial components can translocate across the intestinal lumen into systemic circulation, where then it drives a lot of immune activation and inflammation and oxidative stress. So for example, the lipopolysaccharide endotoxin that is abundant from a dysbiotic leaky gut will translocate, inducing endotoxemia, or sort of a subclinical sepsis, if you will. Those LPS are very potent activators of immune cells, and specifically inducible nitric oxide synthase expressed by those immune cells, which then causes this super physiological nitric oxide level that can be damaging. And it's because of the leakiness of the gut. So by replenishing the intestinal lining, by sealing the tight junctions, promoting healthy mucous membranes by supporting nitric oxide, we can then reduce the leakiness and protect our body, so that way we don't have that endotoxemia, we don't have that leakiness and translocation, right? Now, further, nitric oxide also modulates the activity of the vagus nerve. Certainly, the vagus nerve is a very, very, very cool subject. And it being a nerve, these nerve fibers do express neuronal nitric oxide synthase, right? So nitric oxide, we have to keep in mind, acts as a gasotransmitter. It also regulates the release of other neurotransmitters, such as glutamate or acetylcholine, for example. So with the vagus nerve, many of you might be familiar with the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway, right? So nitric oxide actually directly influences the release of acetylcholine, which can then bind onto the alpha-7 acetylcholine nicotinic receptors here, especially on those macrophages that are expressing inducible nitric oxide synthase, right? Which the iNOS isn't illustrated in this particular diagram, but macrophages are prime immune cells that express inducible nitric oxide synthase. The acetylcholine released by the vagus nerve, assuming that we have adequate nitric oxide signaling, that acetylcholine will activate this cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway and inhibit, or maybe not, I don't think inhibit is the right word, but rather modulate the phenotype of the macrophage. So with macrophages, they can either activate when stimulated and triggered, they can activate into their M1 pro-inflammatory cytotoxic phenotype, or polarize into their M2 anti-inflammatory protective phenotype. And so when we have healthy vagal tone and we have adequate vagus nerve signaling, if that acetylcholine is adequately released, it'll bind onto these alpha-7 receptors to switch the phenotype away from that pro-inflammatory M1 phenotype and towards the anti-inflammatory protective M2 phenotype. But this is contingent upon having adequate nitric oxide, which is regulating the release of that acetylcholine from the vagus nerve, right? Super cool. Now, further expanding this conversation, this is exactly what I've been talking about the past few minutes, where those macrophages, which are one of our primary innate immune cells to go fight off foreign invaders and gobble up pathogens. Again, macrophage, big eater, right? They are there to gobble up the bad guys, so to speak, the naughty microbes, if you will. So these macrophages that might migrate into the intestinal lumen are expressing that INOS, or inducible nitric oxide synthase. Now, INOS is not inherently a bad thing. It's actually a very good thing when we're trying to fight off an infection or foreign invader, when there's some type of immune challenge. The problem with many Americans, many clients and patients is they have a downregulated endothelial nitric oxide synthase and often a downregulated neuronal nitric oxide synthase, but an upregulated inducible nitric oxide synthase. Why? Because their body is leaky. Microbial toxins and endotoxins and toxicants are hyperactivating their immune cells, such as the macrophages. Inducible nitric oxide synthase creates thousands of times more nitric oxide than endothelial or neuronal nitric oxide synthase. So when you're reading the literature and you look at the dual role, nitric oxide can be very healing and health promoting, or it can contribute to more oxidative stress and inflammation and disease. When it is contributing to disease, it's because of increased inducible nitric oxide synthase. So it's not that nitric oxide is to blame. It's inducible nitric oxide synthase being excessively expressed. Why? Because the immune cells are being hyper-stimulated because of leakiness and endotoxin microbial component activation, right? So this is where the epithelial lining in the intestinal lining and the macrophages within the intestinal lumen are all expressing inducible nitric oxide synthase. So when we have a lot of dysbiosis and pathogenic bacteria that are further stimulating this inducible nitric oxide synthase, that can cause problems. So ultimately, we're trying to support healthy nitric oxide signaling and replenishing the microbiome using those dietary nitrates with their prebiotic-like properties. So this is why we have this total nitric oxide solution where we measure salivary nitrite as a surrogate proxy marker for whole body nitric oxide status. And then we have to build that foundation of dietary nitrate, our nitrate reservoir. We have to have that pool or reservoir of nitrate full, so that way we can dip into it in order to reduce into nitrite and nitric oxide as needed for healthy whole body nitric oxide signaling whenever we need it, which is constantly. I really argue we want a healthy pink strip all day, every day. So test, don't guess, use as many strips per day as you need to maintain adequate levels throughout the day. And of course, that nitrate prebiotic gum if we need to restore the oral microbiome. Now, our cognitive product tends to get overlooked a little bit, and I want to highlight it here based on the conversation and some of the science that I just explained, because this cognitive product actually has 3 different botanical ingredients: lutein, Alpinia galanga, and sulforaphane, broccoli sprouts. Now, what's interesting is all three of these ingredients have been shown through the scientific literature to have a down-regulating effect on that inducible nitric oxide synthase. This is a good thing. This is a good thing. It modulates and down-regulates that inducible nitric oxide synthase expressed by the epithelial cells of the intestines, by the macrophages within the intestinal lumen and circulation. And so when we are able to downregulate inducible nitric oxide synthase while promoting healthy nitrate substrate availability to produce healthy nitric oxide, this is the winning combination. This is how we remove somebody from a nitric oxide dysregulated state and move them towards more of a homeostatic redox state and promote healthy nitric oxide signaling. So I wanted to highlight that because the cognitive, it actually is so much more than a cognitive boosting formula. It can actually help protect our nitric oxide molecule. It can modulate the activity of these immune cells and potentially downregulate the inducible nitric oxide synthase. So making sure we use the test strips, see where they're at. We recommend at least 3 test strips per day. I advocate for one first thing out of bed in the morning, see where you're at to start the day. A second strip 90 minutes after taking the nitrate supplement. And then I also advocate for one more test strip before bed. That's my minimal testing schedule. I personally also like to test pre-workout, test post-workout, or any sort of performance-based task. Maybe you have an important work meeting that you need adequate blood flow, cognition, and energy to stay sharp, right? So of course, to wrap this up, we always advocate for healthy lifestyle foundations, a nitrate-rich diet, using the nitrate foundation product, an active lifestyle, physical activity, exercise, great way to boost nitric oxide bioavailability, nasal breathing and breath work, sleep hygiene, stress management, light therapy, the list goes on and on. You know, certainly functional medicine only works if our functional foundations are really in place, making sure that we balance that oral microbiome, which is going to help us reap the benefits of the dietary nitrate that we're either getting from our diet or our dietary nitrate supplement. So we can use that gum to restore an oral dysbiotic microbiome and increase its nitrate reducing capacity. So some good oral hygiene practices that we can be considering, dietary practices, and this is all then that you can boost the efficacy of whatever other therapeutic strategies you like to use, whether it's hormone replacement or peptide therapy, or even stem cells. I was recently talking to a stem cell provider who was saying how, well, the problem is with stem cells, sometimes they're too big to make it through the fine capillaries and make it to the target tissues. Guess what? A little bit of vasodilation with nitric oxide to open up the vasculature, open up those fine blood vessels, and we can more effectively deliver the nutrients or the pharmaceuticals or the stem cells or the hormones or whatever you're using in your practice. So certainly, management of healthy nitric oxide levels for all patients is necessary to support symptom improvement in the gut and everywhere else in the body. This simple 3-step protocol for testing and supporting nitric oxide allows patients to feel and function better more quickly. Nitric oxide simply makes everything else you're doing work better. So some key takeaways. If you haven't been paying attention to the nitric oxide, you need to. Nitric oxide, in my opinion, is the missing link in chronic disease care. And regular self-testing also will increase compliance. Seeing is believing. So when you have your patients and clients take a tube of test strips home and teach them how to effectively use these to guide the nitrate ingestion, will increase compliance and increase successful clinical outcomes. So this has been the More You Know series. I hope you enjoyed it. Share it with a colleague, a loved one, a friend, a patient, a client, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys in the next episode. Thank you so much.